If I were forced to lock my portfolio today to build wealth and never sell, I would build a machine designed to survive every possible economic reality. My strategy would rely on three specific ETFs that together cover growth, insurance, and cash flow. These are the three funds I would buy and hold forever. Hello everyone, I'm Professor Portfolio, and I believe wealth takes time. This channel is for people who want to build wealth slowly and intelligently. We'll use diversified portfolios, patience, and discipline instead of gambling on the next meme stock. Let's cut to the chase. First, the engine, VTI, the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF. This is where I would put roughly 50 to 60% of the portfolio. The expense ratio is 0.03%, meaning for every $10,000 invested, I pay about $3 a year in fees. In return, I get exposure to around 3,700 U.S. companies across large, mid, and small caps. Most people default to an S&P 500 fund like VO. There's nothing wrong with that, but VTI quietly does more. The S&P 500 only gives you the 500 largest companies. VTI tracks the CRSP U.S. Total Market Index, meaning you get those same giants plus thousands of mid-cap and small-cap stocks. Historically, smaller companies have often delivered higher returns than large caps, though with more volatility. By owning VTI, I'm not just buying today's winners. I'm giving myself a chance to benefit from tomorrow's winners. VTI is also what I think of as a self-cleansing machine. It runs on pure market Darwinism. When a company dominates, it naturally grows into a larger weight. When a company stumbles, its weight shrinks and eventually drops out of the index. There is no emotional decision, no panic selling, no story chasing, just a rules-based process that quietly upgrades the portfolio over time. Since launching in 2001, this fund has lived through the dot-com aftermath, the 2008 global financial crisis, the European debt crisis, and the 2020 pandemic crash. Through all of that, the U.S. stock market has continued to reach new highs over the long run. You don't have to predict which sector wins next. You don't need to time the market. By holding VTI, you simply own the market, let the winners rise, and let the losers fade. That's why VTI is the engine I would be comfortable holding for life. Second, the hedge, VXUS, the Vanguard Total International Stock ETF. Here I would allocate about 20 to 30% of the portfolio. The expense ratio is around 0.05%. And in exchange, I get exposure to more than 8,600 companies outside the United States. VXUS tracks the FTSE Global All-Cap ex-U.S. Index, which means developed markets and emerging markets from Europe, Asia, Latin America, and beyond. The reason I hold VXUS is to defend against something called home country bias. Most investors heavily overweight the country they live in. U.S. investors pour nearly everything into U.S. stocks. And right now that feels smart because the United States has dominated performance for the last decade and a half. But markets move in long supercycles. The U.S. is not always on top. From 2000 to 2009, the so-called lost decade for the S&P 500, a U.S. large-cap investor essentially went nowhere over 10 years. In that same period, many international and emerging market stocks did far better. Go back further, and you have the 1980s, when Japanese equities dominated global returns. Leadership changes. No one country wins every decade. VXUS is my way of saying, I don't know which country or region will lead over the next 30 years, and I don't have to know. Inside VXUS, I own companies the U.S. simply does not have. Taiwan's TSMC, which manufactures the chips that power Apple and Nvidia. ASML from the Netherlands, which makes the critical machines needed to produce advanced semiconductors. Global consumer and industrial powerhouses in Europe and Asia. Pharmaceutical leaders like Novo Nordisk in Denmark. Auto giants like Toyota in Japan. These companies generate real cash flows from all over the world and operate in different currencies and different economic environments. If the U.S. enters a period of stagnation, or if the dollar weakens over time, VXUS helps protect my purchasing power. It spreads my risk across the rest of the global economy. That is why I treat VXUS as my insurance policy and geopolitical hedge. Something I can hold forever, not to beat the U.S. every year, but to reduce the risk that my entire future depends on one country's stock market.